Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study on the Gospel of Mark. We're going to look at chapter 1, verses 29 through 32. Very interesting discussion in this lesson on the Secrecy-Motif. So let's go to block 1 and look at the text. Okay, block 1. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and the demon-possessed. So we have Christ, after the synagogue, he goes to Simon Peter's house. And he may have stayed at Simon Peter's house when he headquartered out of Capernaum. We don't know for sure, but he may have. Let's go to the commentary and take a look at Ruckman and Edwards. We have very good commentary this time. Let's go to block 2. We'll begin with Ruckman. The Sabbath ended at 6 p.m. on Saturday. After this time, the sick in Capernaum sought out Christ at the home of Simon Peter. Now, Edwards. In later centuries, the home of Peter was venerated as a gathering place for Christians. This began at the end of the first century. And it may be that Jesus lived with Peter in Capernaum while he headquartered out of the Capernaum synagogue. In the Gospel of Mark, we find that Jesus will have no allegiance with a following that is extracted from feelings of amazement or astonishment. Instead, allegiance to Christ only is genuine through faith and humility. Jesus never wanted people to follow him because he performed miracles. He wanted those who would follow the truth, hear what he had to say with spiritual hearing, perceive what he had to say with spiritual perception. And today, as in the first century, the only genuine way to follow Christ is through faith and humility. And that is going to help us to understand better this next commentary by Edwards on the Secrecy-Motif. And this is very interesting. So I want to go over this, but keep in mind that last comment that we just had there on genuine faith and humility. Let's go to block 2, note 3 now. Okay. Edwards on the Secrecy-Motif. The Secrecy-Motif is an inherent part of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus commands silence after 4 miracles. See 144, 643, 736, 826, cleansing a leper, raising a dead girl, healing a deaf mute, healing a blind man. Also, only inside with the disciples does Jesus explain the mysteries of the kingdom. Public ministry is cloaked in parables. See 4, 10 through 12. And Jesus revealed his transfigured glory only to his most intimate followers in a very guarded setting. And all of that is very true. I agree with all of that. But I love this final comment by Edwards. But in all of this, Mark's presentation of Jesus stands with essential continuity with the historical Jesus, with the Jesus of history. But this Jesus didn't want followers based on a sign-like miracle. In fact, he refused to give sign-like miracles when at the Capernaum, remember John chapter 6 in Capernaum, when everybody said, let it rain down manna from heaven, show us a miracle, let it rain down manna from heaven, and then we can believe. Jesus did not want followers who sought for sensationalism. He wanted followers who listened to the truth. He came to proclaim the truth. He looked for those who would follow based on faith and humility. So I love that final statement. But in all of this, Mark's presentation of Jesus stands with essential continuity with the historical Jesus, and I believe that 100%. But we do find that in these miracles listed by Edwards, Jesus commands silence after the miracles. He says, go to the temple, and thank God for the healing you received, or give testimony concerning what you have received, or simply he would say, go in peace. But he did not want people to follow him based on sensationalism at all. He came to proclaim the truth. He had said he was the way, the truth, and the life, and he wanted followers who would follow him based on faith and humility. So I love this additional commentary by Edwards on the Secrecy-Motif, because we will see that as we get into these miracles of the cleansing of a leper, the raising of a dead girl, the healing of a deaf mute, and the healing of a blind man. But it is interesting that that is very much a part of the Gospel of Mark. It's very much reinforced by John Mark that Christ wanted followers of the truth in faith and humility, not followers based on sensationalism. Let's go to the Greek. We'll take I'm looking at 30, 31, and 32. Let's look at verse 30. Panthera Simon, Katakaiko Pyresusa. The mother-in-law of Simon was laying sick with fever, from Pareso, sick with fever. Now verse 31. Egairen auten kratesas tes kairos. He raised her up, having taken her hand. And that word for raise up is egairo. You notice the first word is egairen. Egairo is often used for resurrection, so it's he raised her up with a powerful resurrecting power, having taken her hand. Kaiha Pyreas Aphaken Auten, and the fever was sent away from her. And that's what it means. Jesus he drove the fever out and sent it away. It's from ephimi, to send away. Very powerful. But also that word egairo in verse 31 is it says egairen there, but it's from egairo. Very powerful word. It's the word oftentimes used for resurrection. Verse 32, Epheron pros auton. They began bringing to him to kakas kai daimondezemanos, the sick and those under the power of evil, from diamonidzomai, which can be demon-possessed or simply under the power of evil. Obviously, demon, daimonidzomai. So we find that frequently in Mark's gospel that Christ is in a battle with spiritual opposition. The plurality of evil stands against the Holy One of God. And Christ, very often notice that it says in this passage that that evening after, verse 32, that evening after the sunset, the people brought to Jesus the sick and those demon-possessed. Mark always brings up this spiritual battle of the Holy One with the plurality of evil. And remember the Gospel of John, the Apostle John in 1 John told us that the Antichrist is not a singularity. The Antichrist is a plurality of evil. And that's one of the last books of the New Testament. Mark's one of the first books in the New Testament. And Mark also speaks of the plurality of evil. It's always a plurality of evil that is fighting against the Holy One of God, as Mark describes him. So it's a very, very good section of Scripture, and it shows us again that We have this spiritual battle in the realm of the spirit, in the realm of the supernatural, and Mark is again testifying to the divine authority of Christ. He works out of, he speaks out of, he acts out of the ousia essence of God, the essence of being. Christ acts out of and teaches out of the ousia essence of being, the I am. He is a member of the triune Godhead. But in this lesson, for me, what I thought was very powerful is Block 2, Note 3, and we'll just look at it briefly here one more time to close up. The secrecy motif is an inherent part of this Gospel of Mark. Jesus commands silence after 4 miracles: the cleansing of a leper, the raising of a dead girl, the healing of a deaf mute, the healing of a blind man. Remember the raising of the dead girl? He only allowed Peter, James, and John to go into the room where the girl was laying down, where her body was. He only allowed 3, Simon Peter, James, and John, to go with him, and the mother and the father, when he raised the dead girl. Again, a secrecy motif. And also, only inside with the disciples does Jesus explain the mysteries of the kingdom. Public ministry is cloaked in parables. See 4:10 through 12. And then the transfiguration. Again, it's Peter, James, and John. Only the most intimate followers in a very guarded setting were allowed to witness the transfiguration of Christ in doxa glory, in the doxa glory of God, the doxa glory of the divine, where they saw Elijah and Moses with Christ. And then the final statement. But in all of this, Mark's presentation of Jesus is definitely in a with essential continuity with the Jesus of history. So what Edwards is saying is don't try to explain this away. Instead, affirm it, that there is a secrecy motif in many instances with Christ, and just recognize that he wasn't looking for followers that would follow him due to sensationalism. It was not about that. So that's why Mark emphasizes this, and I think it's really important that Edwards brings this up. So for me, put a big circle around Block 2, Note 3. I think that's a very good section of commentary on these scriptures. And also in the Greek, verse 31, that word egeiron. Just remember that Christ raising up the mother-in-law, it's a very powerful word because it's often used in the New Testament for resurrection. He raises her up and drives out the fever that the mother-in-law was suffering with. So verse 31, very powerful in the Greek, very, very powerful. But I think primarily we have to look at this lesson as possibly telling us that during the ministry in Galilee, where Jesus headquartered at the Capernaum synagogue, that very possibly Christ actually stayed at Peter's house. It's very, very possible. Edwards affirms that in his commentary. He says it's very possible. The way he words it, I'll just use his language. It may be that Jesus lived with Peter in Capernaum. And we know in his Jerusalem ministry, Jesus stayed with Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. So it's not unusual for him to stay at someone's home. So in Jerusalem, he stayed with Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. In Capernaum, in Galilee, with his Capernaum synagogue headquarters, it's very possible that he stayed at the house of Simon Peter. It's very possible. Very good lesson. Again, for me, Block 2, Note 3. That's going to wrap up 129 through 32. We will continue in Chapter 1 next lesson.